Do you see red flags when you're at IEP or ARD meetings? Like, do you get pushback when you ask for something different than what the school usually does? Well, there are ways that we can create more options when we go to meetings at school. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Because so many times we get stuck in that fear mode of, I don't know, can I ask? What's the response? Am I going to get retaliated if I ask for something different? Well, not only do we want some specific techniques for creating more options, but I also want to talk today about how we got to change our mindset in order for us to be open to believing that there are more possibilities out there for our kids. So, if you are new to our show, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, and advocate. And my passion, my mission is to help you become an even more effective advocate for your child. So I'm so glad you are with us, either live or on the replay. Type in where you're viewing us from. It's always fun to see all the different states that we have represented. Like I said, today we're going to be kind of opening up our minds to looking at another way to see things and another way to create that collaboration at the IEP or the ARD meeting. And one of the things I was thinking of, since it's back to school time, I'm going to give away a copy of my book, which has been a #1 bestseller on Amazon, The Art of Advocacy, A Parent's Guide to a Collaborative IEP Process. So if you'd like to be entered in the giveaway, just type in the comments why you would love to get a copy of my book, The Art of Advocacy. And we'll leave this giveaway up so people who are watching the replay can enter too. But let's see, this is Thursday. By Friday, September 7th at 6 p.m., I'll come back to this thread and I'll read all the comments about why you would love a copy of the book. You'll be entered and I'll have Siri or Alexa draw a number, and that lucky person will have a book on their way. So let me know if you'd like that. The other thing I wanted to talk about also is this is a third video in a 4-part series. So previously we had done a video about solving people problems at IEP meetings. And we also had done a video about how to get to yes when you're at school meetings. So this is the third one, which is talking about creating more options. Next week, we'll have the fourth and final video, which will be about how you decide which option is the best to use. So as I said at the beginning of the broadcast, we want to look at some mindset things. And I love this quotation from Thomas Edison, and he says, "When you've exhausted all possibilities, remember this: you haven't." So again, we want to be open and we want to realize that there are numerous ways of solving concerns and problems and issues, and we want to look at some strategic ways that we can do this. It's really, because we're building this on a series, it's really important for you to have seen video 1 and video 2. So if you want the links for those, just type the word videos in the comments, and then my IEP bot can send you the links for the first 2 videos in the series. So just type in videos and I'll get you those links. So I want to say hi. We've got some live viewers with us, so it's always fun to see who's with us live. So make sure you feel comfortable typing in comments or questions throughout the show, and we will get them answered here. So I wanted to talk a little bit, just kind of go back and kind of summarize. That first video was about how to solve people problems. And what we did is we talked about, let me share this. We talked about kind of that tug of war that a lot of times can happen when you're at IEP or ARD meetings. And that is like the first part of this process. We have to figure out, and we have to be able to separate the people from the problem. And, you know, you probably heard be hard on that problem and soft on people. So video 1 was all about that. So you'll be getting the links for that. And then the second one that we did was how to get yes at IEP meetings. And one of the big things that we talked about here was asking probing and clarifying questions, because that's how you're going to get to the underlying interests. And we'll talk about this a little bit more today, but in the second video, it's just like super important to be able to distinguish between somebody's position, the stance that they're taking, and the underlying issue that might be happening. So that was all in our second video. And all of these principles come from, so like I said, then today we're talking about getting more options at the table. And these principles come from the book Getting to Yes, which you've probably heard of before. So there's 4 different pillars or, you know, key points to principal negotiations: people, interests, and options, and then criteria. So we're on number 3 today. We're going to be talking about options. One of the things, you may have seen an interview that I did with Julie Costin, and the thing that I loved about that was she talked about ways that you know, when we look at service minutes, you know, near the end of the IEP form, it talks about, you know, direct service minutes. Sometimes it talks about consultation. But what Julie Costin had recommended was look at those direct service minutes that your child has and see if some of those could be taken away and put in as consultation or indirect service time, in order for the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher to have time for co-planning. So that is one of those kind of think outside of the box ideas, because I know so many parents want their kids to be successfully included in the general ed class. And when they ask for that, they get so much pushback at IEP or ARD meetings. And so I want us to say, you know, that's our goal, to have our child included. But there's going to be several ways to get to that goal. One of them is if the school trains teachers on co-teaching. Another way is if we can carve out some minutes in that service table for your child so that the teachers can actually have planning time in order to make co-teaching really a positive situation. So if any of this is resonating with you, let me know in the comments. You know what, and the other thing I think that would be helpful for today's show is if you have a particular situation where you have asked for something and been told no, or, you know, it's like a big disagreement, you know, give me a short synopsis of that, and we can use that as an example as we go forward through our show today about how we can actually take that, and I can show you about the different options that you can have. So one of the things that I'm going to do is, and this is kind of hard to see, but one of the things that I'm going to do in my weekly blog post, I talk about the, you know, the latest show that we had, and I give key highlights and everything. But I'm going to attach this to my blog post this coming week. And this, to me, is like an outline that you can use when you go to meetings. So let me read it to you. At the top, I again have that Thomas Edison quote. When you have exhausted all possibilities, remember this, you haven't. But when when you're preparing to go to meetings, there's things that you can do ahead of time that make that IEP or that ARD meeting go even more smoothly. So one of the tips is to see about scheduling a pre-meeting before the actual IEP meeting, and use that as a time to check in with the staff. They can share and explain data that they've been collecting on progress monitoring. But one of the things that you can do during those pre-meetings is really have some open-ended brainstorming time to say, this is working really well here. How can we make sure that it's going to work well in this class? Or, my child's having some challenges, during science class. What are some things that we might be able to tweak? And then the key is whatever you talk about at that pre-meeting or the brainstorming time, you want to capture what you've, gotten consensus on, and you want to bring that to the IEP meeting because you want all of that to be reflected in writing. So if you came up with some fantastic new ideas to try when you were meeting beforehand, make sure those then get written in the IEP, so then the school's accountable for doing that. So let me know in the comments, do you, on a regular basis, I don't know, different schools do it different ways, but Angie or Dami or Cindy, do any of you have, where you pretty much regularly schedule pre-meetings before you have the actual IEP or ARD meeting? I'd just be curious as to what some people do. I know there was one mom that's a friend of mine, and what she would do is she would have a pre-meeting and she would do it one-on-one with each teacher that her child had. And this is when they were in secondary school, so they had, different teachers for different subjects. But she would actually sit down with teachers and individually and talk about what the goals are going to be, what accommodations are working. Because, so many times I think people have this kind of mentality that the meeting is going to be an hour long and we just kind of need to rush through this and check all the boxes and get everything written in because we've got another set of parents waiting in the hallway. And the problem is, so many times you don't have any time to do any kind of real sharing or discussing or, so sometimes if you have that meeting ahead of time, that can be the time where you have more, back and forth dialogue, and then you can bring that to the IEP meeting to kind of finalize in writing. So let me know if you've done anything like that, because I'd be interested to see how that's worked for you. Now, the other thing is, the reality is, we pretty much all of us are working parents, either working at home, working, at a 9-to-5 job, and it might not be possible to schedule a pre-meeting. It's like hard enough for you to get off of work to go to the IEP meeting. So if that's the case, then use another way, right? We're about creating more options today. So think about emailing the staff input that you have. And some teachers, I love it, some teachers are sending parents a questionnaire to fill out before they start writing a draft IEP to get parents ideas about goals or what their child's strengths are, what the big picture is of what you want your child to be able to do after high school. So if your teacher does that, thank them because that's wonderful for the school to take that step to engage and ask you for your input. So Mailing your input before an IEP meeting would also be a good idea. So let me know if your teachers do any of these ideas, or if you found other ones that have worked for you. Now, sometimes you think, oh, this is such a common one, but, working with a variety of families and actually a variety of states around the country, not everyone understands or knows that as a parent, you can ask for a draft IEP ahead of time. And this is a really good habit to get into. So, here we are, the beginning of a new school year. One of the suggestions I have is to jot things down on your calendar or put them in your phone calendar. But one of the things, besides knowing when that IEP, review meeting or whatever, when that date is, then you want to go back a couple weeks and mark on your calendar, email teacher for draft IEP. You want to give teachers a heads up that you'd like the draft IEP a few days before the meeting. Because I know as a former special ed teacher, you are like so busy that sometimes you don't have your draft done very far in advance. So you want to make sure that you ask the teacher about that a couple of weeks before the IEP is actually going to be presented at the meeting, and that you want a draft copy. Sometimes you'll hear, we don't send out draft copies. We all write it together at the meeting, but they do have some ideas of what they're going to work on for goals and such. So go ahead and ask for that draft IEP. Now, the other thing to think about is if you can't get a draft IEP ahead of time, the reality is you're going to need some extra time for the actual IEP meeting. So if you get pushback and they're not comfortable sending the draft ahead of time, I would say, there's different strategies you can take. Some parents have been given the draft IEP at the IEP meeting. They've never seen it before. They ask for, a time where they can step outside and read it over. Some parents will say, thank you, and let's reschedule now that I have the draft. It depends on your situation, but if you're seeing the document for the very first time, it's going to be hard for you to be thinking of other possibilities and other options for your child when you're just kind of absorbing that draft IEP for the first time. So does this make sense? And like I said, if you have a situation, a specific issue that you're working on with the school and you want us to use that as an example, type that in the comments and I'd be happy to give you or use that example as we go through things here. So if we go back to this, and like I said, this will be on my blog post. So if you don't get my weekly blog post and would like to, just type in, let me know in the comments below that you'd like to get on my list for the weekly blog post. But if we go through this kind of format, the first thing that you're going to identify is what topic or what issue do you have that you want to discuss. And then I think it's always important to talk about the student's strengths and needs, because I always, whatever we're talking about, I always want to look at what my son or daughter's strengths are and how we can use that in the school setting, how the teachers can teach, my son through those strengths. And we know, since it's an IEP, we also have to identify our child's needs. So you are building your case here for kind of what you want, what your child needs at the end of the IEP meeting. So please think about what the strengths are, bring that to each meeting with you. And also have specific needs. Like if you want your child included, some of the specific needs could be, my child needs typical age peers for behavior models, for communication models. He needs to practice these skills in the general ed classroom in the natural setting. So when you have those specific needs identified, then when you're looking at creating some placement options, you can say, remember, we want to make sure we go back and meet these needs. So you're going to talk about the issue. In this case, we'll use the example of inclusion. You'll talk about your child's strengths, like they imitate others' behavior. They're more of a visual learner. So when they see other kids doing a task, they know, and it helps them understand what to do. Talk about those strengths and talk about the needs for them to be with the typical peers. And then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to identify your own position, which is kind of like that stance that you take. So in this example, we're talking about inclusion. The parent position might be, I want my child included. I mean, end of story, right? And that's your position. But we also have to identify those underlying interests on why we're saying we want our child included. And this was in video 2 of the series. So if you want to get the link for that, just type videos in the comments and my IEP bot will respond with those links. So before we even go to the meeting, it's really helpful for us to identify the position, which is usually, pretty easy. I want my kid included. And then the underlying interests, the why of why you want that. Because whatever option we create has to meet that underlying interest, or it's not going to be something that you're going to be excited about having the team agree to. So does that make sense? So once you know your underlying interests on why you want your child included, that's going to help you figure out some options, and that's going to help you make sure whatever option gets decided on is really going to be beneficial and meet that underlying interest that you have. Now, on the other side, we have school staff, all the other members of the IEP team. And guess what? They, just like us, come to meetings with positions. And they might be coming to the meeting with a position of, what we've been doing in our resource room has been working so well for years. We're just going to keep on serving kids with our resource, model. Well, that's their position. That's their stance. But what we have to figure out is, what are their underlying interests? Why are they saying we're going to stick with this resource model? Because whatever options we create, whatever options we decide on, guess what? They have to meet the underlying interests of the school also. And so you're going, what? That's not what I want to hear. But that's the reality of having collaboration and coming to a consensus of something that's going to work for your child. So again, these principles come from that book, Getting to Yes, and it was written decades ago. But if you've never read it, or you have it and you want to go back and reread it, it really, really is helpful. So the other thing is, make sure that you spend some time thinking about things like this before you walk into the meeting. Because otherwise, it's going to be really hard to kind of do that on the fly. And Kelly is with us, and Kelly says, very good point. Excuse me. And Angie has asked for the video links, and Dami and Cindy. So if you want those video links, just put the word videos in the box below. So let's look at those positions and interests. That's the next thing that, like I said, that you're going to be doing here. You're going to identify your positions and interests. You're going to identify the school's position and interests. And then you're going to start talking about some options. And sometimes we think of options as they only come at the end of the IEP meeting when we're talking about options of, placement and what's going to be the least restrictive environment. But creating options is really, you have an opportunity to do that throughout the IEP, because look at the goals. I mean, you have choices, you have options about what goals you're going to write. You have options, you have choices, there's different possibilities. Do you want your child to keep working on counting coins when hardly anyone in the world uses coins anymore, right? Do you want your child having to learn how to read an analog clock when you don't even have any analog clocks in your house and everything is digital? You have choices and you have options about what goals get into your child's IEP. But you want to be thinking about that beforehand and not just trying to figure it out right there when you're in the meeting. The other thing is look at accommodations. Accommodations is a great section of the IEP to talk about options. Assistive technology. There are so many options with assistive technology. Is your child going to use a smart pen when writing notes so then they can have that auditory feedback and hear from their pen the lecture that the teacher was, providing that day in class? Is your child going to use a standalone communication device? Is your child going to use a communication app on an iPad or a tablet? Those are all choices. Those are all options. And so many times when we're at meetings, we see that red flag when we say, let's think, is there another way we could do this differently this year? And if you get that closed reaction of, no, we're not thinking differently, you need to go back to some of the tips that we talked about in our video 1, where we were talking about dealing with more difficult people. But you want the team to see, and you want the team to develop that what if thinking. Like, what if we started using the iPad or the tablet, and then when John went to different classes, it would be so much more lightweight for him to carry. He likes using the iPad more than the communication device. Let's try, what about if we try using that communication app instead? And then you pause and you wait for people at the table to give their input. Because another thing that I see so often is, have parents ask questions at IEP meetings or ARD meetings, and then they don't pause and wait for people sitting on the other side of the table to have their input and their conversation. You want to have people identify maybe what they're worried about, what their fears are, because then when you create options, you can make sure those options address those fears. A common one I know is for classroom teachers to support the idea of inclusion, and from a philosophical, from a values place, it's like, yes, all kids belong, all kids should be in general ed. But then when it comes down to actually having that child with significant disabilities come into their classroom, it's like, oh, I'm not quite sure I'm ready for this. And you need to know that, because then one of your options can be to provide teacher training. And that can be written in the IEP, staff training for anyone who works with your child. can be something that you write in the supplemental aids and services part of the IEP. So each part of the IEP, you have options, you have choices. The team has options and choices. And you don't want to, just because we did this last year, we're going to keep doing it. We don't want cut and paste IEPs where we have pretty much the same goals and the same list of accommodations that nobody remembers and nobody does, right? We want to really think about what's been working. We want to go back to that beginning of the process where we talked about your child's strengths and make sure that the accommodation options we pick, make sure that they tap into your child's strengths. So all of this should be connected in the IEP. And it shouldn't be each little box in an IEP is something totally separate and some standalone. It's almost like sometimes you think about building a house with that foundation, and your child's strengths and needs are a foundation. And then you're going to be talking about goals. And again, choices, right? You have a choice of what goals you have. You have accommodations. And then towards the end of the IEP, you're going to be talking about service time. And if you missed the beginning, we had talked about a time when Julie Costin was with us, and she talked about taking some direct service time and using it as consultation time. Or the other thing you could do is your child still gets all that direct service time, but you also build in consultation time on the IEP specifically for the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher to have common planning so they can support each other, and especially if they're doing co-teaching. So throughout the IEP, you want to be creating those options. And then, of course, when you get to the placement, that is sometimes where the sticking point happens. And Angela is with us, and she's saying hi. So, hey, Angela, thanks for being here. If you are, okay, so Angie has a question. She said, I ask questions, and generally they just look at each other, trying to figure out how to respond. After a minute or so, someone will usually agree to try something new, but then nothing ever happens. Have to follow up with each and everything, or it never gets done. So give us a thumbs up and the emojis there if this has been something that you've experienced too, where it's like, yeah, they finally agreed to try something new, but then it never really gets implemented. And that is, unfortunately, like a common thing. I was talking to a mom the other day, and I said, so many times we just want to be a mom, right? I mean, we want to have time to relax and enjoy our kids and do fun things. And we don't want to have to be an advocate for our kids. We don't want to have to think about all this stuff and go to meetings and figure all this out. But the reality is, right? We have to, or nobody else is going to do it. So I keep saying I'm going to invent or manufacture, I guess, badges that say IEP police, and I'll deputize all of you. Because, again, the reality is it's almost like we have to be IEP police officers to make sure that what we decided and agreed on actually gets implemented every day. I know, and so Caitlin has a comment here too. She says that parental concern letters and prior written notice letters have helped get services and protects the teachers as they fight for our kids against the district. And Caitlin, yes. I mean, I was a teacher for 30 years, and I think I often felt I was in that position where I was advocating for my kids, and it was a lot of times kind of in opposition of the district. So I also want us to recognize that there are teachers that are in this with us and are your allies and your supporters. So make sure that you recognize that you thank them, because a lot of times their speaking up is something that, can kind of jeopardize their position in the building, and they worry about what their evaluation is going to look like from the principal if they speak up. But we do need positive, relationships built with teachers. So please make sure, that's what we talked about in video 1, was that relationship that we need to develop with teachers. And then we see the trust building, and then we see people being more willing to try other things during meetings and such. So I just have enjoyed our chat. I would love for you to type in any other questions or comments you have, because I love when we can be more interactive, and we, like I said, can take situations that are happening in your life and make them, use them so we can kind of, go through and help other teachers and parents see the process. But like I said, I'm going to be sharing this kind of process of how to create different options when I do my next blog post. So if you would like to, get emails with my weekly blog posts, just let me know in the comments and I can add you to my list. But one of my goals is to have some kind of practical resource that I can give you each time we do a weekly live show. And I want to be able to create other resources or let you know about other resources. So those are some of the things that I put in my blog posts. But if we don't have any other questions or comments, I want to thank you again for being here. I want you to believe in the possibilities and know that we can take all the members of the IEP team and develop that what if thinking, and really spend some time either before or during the meeting to brainstorm and think about other ways that we can do things. Because otherwise the meetings just become this formality. And I don't think that's what the spirit of the law was or is. So I encourage you to dwell in the possibilities this year, to be open and to ask other team members to be open to think about what if, and that will create more wonderful possibilities for your child. So I hope the year is getting off to a great start. If you do ever have questions about how things are going, type them there on our Visions and Voices Together Facebook page, and I'll be happy to, to have some time with you to brainstorm some different options. So until next Thursday at noon Mountain Time, I'm Charmaine Tanner, and have a great week. Bye-bye.